Hi, my name is Daniel Trafford, and today I'll be talking about the effects of mental fatigue and attentional focus on co-activation during isometric endurance exercise. So to start, what is mental fatigue? Well, mental fatigue is an experience that everyone has every day. It's that feeling you get after or during prolonged periods of cognitive activity, and it's what makes you feel tired. Simply, it's the barrier that limits your likelihood of doing something you might have otherwise done. And more practically, after a long day of work, it's what leaves you feeling tired and drained. It's in this state that you're most likely not to choose to be physically active. But not only is mental fatigue a barrier to exercise, it's also a barrier while exercising. This is seen when performing endurance exercise tasks like biking or holding a sustained contraction for a long time. Mental fatigue has shown to negatively affect performance. So in a study done in 2017 by Brown and Bray, they had participants perform two endurance hand grip squeezes, one before and one after a mental fatigue manipulation. Throughout the duration of the task, participants had to maintain a 50% maximum voluntary contraction. And what we see is participants in the high mental fatigue condition perform significantly worse than those in the low mental fatigue condition on their second task. While performance was also affected, we also see that the muscles were affected. When we look at the primary wrist flexors and the changes in proportional EMG amplitude over time, what we see is that the high mental fatigue group performed significantly worse than the low mental fatigue group, or rather, they had greater activation than the low mental fatigue group. Another study was then performed using the same procedure and hand grip squeeze task, and what they found was that the wrist flexor activation was again greater in the mentally fatigued condition, but they also looked at the wrist extensor muscles. When observing the wrist extensor muscles, we see that, again, high mental fatigue had significantly greater activation in the wrist extensor muscles, just like the wrist flexor muscles. With both muscles having similar activation patterns, we wanted to see if they increased at the same rate. More specifically, we created something called the co-activation index to measure if there was an absolute proportional increase between the muscles. To see this, we just create the formula using the antagonist minus the agonist muscle. If they were equal and increasing at the same rate, then the CAI would be equal to 0. When we look at the graph, we see that for both the high mental fatigue and the low mental fatigue condition, that both were straddling the 0 line, and both were actually statistically equivalent to 0 using a two one-sided tail test. Overall, this means that regardless of mental fatigue, both agonist and antagonist muscles are activating and increasing at the same proportional amount. Understanding how mental fatigue affects muscles now, we can try to use this knowledge to attempt to reduce the effects of mental fatigue on muscle activation. More specifically, we want to look at, can attentional focus improve muscle activation patterns when mentally fatigued? The reason for asking this is because attentional focus has seen similar effects on performance as mental fatigue, but rather than having a negative effect, an external focus has shown to improve performance. This means that by focusing on the outcome or goal, which is an external focus, rather than focusing on the movement or bodily sensations, which is an internal focus, one can improve their overall performance. In a study done by Lowe's and Sherwood, they had participants perform an endurance wall sit task, and they found that participants who performed the external focus performed better. But further than another study, Lowe's and Sherwood had participants perform isometric endurance plantar flexion task, and they found that participants in the external focus compared to internal focus had significantly less antagonist muscle activation than the internal focus group. And this can be seen in the blue line here with the significantly less activation. So overall, this leads to the hypothesis for my study, which is that an external attentional focus will decrease the amount of antagonist activation, improving agonist muscle activation when mentally fatigued. So for our study, we recruited 78 participants to take part in the studies. Of those, 2 had bad EMG signal and 3 were considered outliers, resulting in a total sample size of 73 participants with a mean age of 19. This study was double-blinded and used a 2x2 factorial design, so for mental fatigue and attentional focus. And so for this study, we decided to use an endurance wall sit task for the exercise task, as both mental fatigue and attentional focus literature have seen the effects using this task. We then chose to place electrodes on the quadricep muscles as well as on the biceps femoris for muscle comparison EMG. However, due to machine malfunction, only the rectus femoris was used within the quadricep muscles for EMG activation. We then can move on towards our procedure, and when we look at procedure, we first had participants perform their endurance wall sit task until failure. We then split them into either the high or low mental fatigue conditions, performing the incongruent street task or the watching the documentary video, respectively. We then further divided them into an external or internal focus, and then had them perform a secondary wall sit task until failure. This created a total of 4 groups, which we can see here, and this helped us with our analysis as we could split them up to analyze both how mental fatigue affected performance, how attentional focus affected performance, and then how the individual conditions affected performance. So now looking at the results, when we look at mental fatigue, we see actually contrary to research, the low mental fatigue participants experienced more agonist activation than the high mental fatigue group, although it was insignificant. So this definitely will affect if attentional focus can improve mental fatigue, as mental fatigue doesn't seem to be affecting the muscle activation patterns as previously seen. But we can still look at the co-activation index, and what we see is both the high mental fatigue and low mental fatigue group still are statistically equivalent to 0, meaning that regardless of mental fatigue, the muscles activate together. We then look at the results for attentional focus activation, and we see that regardless of attentional focus, more or less are the same, with internal focus causing slightly greater activation than the external focus. When we look at the attentional focus co-activation index, what we see is, again, these results are statistically equivalent to 0, showing us that regardless of attentional focus, you will still experience both the agonist and antagonist muscle activating at the same amount. Lastly, when we look at the mental fatigue and attentional focus conditions and their co-activation index, we can see that regardless of condition, again, all conditions experience a statistically equivalent to 0 co-activation index, or that both muscles are activating the same amount. Overall, from this study, what we can understand is that mental fatigue may affect muscle activation patterns in the lower limb differently than the upper limb, as we saw that low mental fatigue performed better than the high mental fatigue. But regardless of mental fatigue state or the attentional focus state, we see that the agonist and the antagonist muscle work synergistically to maintain force production, as seen by the statistically equivalent co-activation results. Further, we see that this does support central fatigue theory, and believe the whole body is affected holistically when mentally fatigued. And last but not least, we see that future research is needed as we don't have a full understanding of what we're seeing, and there are still some limitations to our study. Thank you for your time, and I'd like to acknowledge the following people for all their hard work.